Congressman, thank you for being here with us. Yeah, there we go. That's the spirit. I'm here for it. Well, Congressman Torres, you've distinguished yourself as a pro-crypto Democrat. You're very out front on the issue. You recently established the Congressional Crypto Congress with your Crypto Caucus with your colleague on the other side of the aisle, Congressman Tom Emmer. But you also come from, I think, the poorest district in the country. So why do you care about crypto? Help tie these sort of issues together for me.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I see crypto as a profoundly progressive technology. It has the power to revolutionize the internet by creating a new layer known as Web3. And it has the power to revolutionize finance. And as you said, I represent the lowest income congressional district in America. I represent people who have been left behind by the traditional financial system. 20% of the Bronx is unbanked, 30% is underbanked. There are immigrants in my district who pay exorbitant fees simply to transfer their remittances to loved ones abroad. And so I'm drawn to the power of blockchain to create a better and cheaper, faster payment system. About a decade ago, the Department of Consumer Affairs did a study and found that the lowest income people spend more than $200 million on check cashing fees here in New York. Right? These are people who are preyed upon by predatory financial services. And so I feel like blockchain has the power to enable real-time transactions. Stablecoin has the power to digitize the dollar. And the combination of those two technologies, the ability to move the dollar at the speed of the blockchain, can create a better and cheaper and faster payment system that could liberate the lowest income from the high fees and long delays of the traditional financial system. So that, to me, is one of the greatest appeals that crypto has.
It's interesting because what drew me to crypto is also the idea that it's a fundamentally progressive technology. And that's not a universally shared idea. I think there's a lot of Democrats in Congress, a lot of people on your side of the aisle who look at the issue and they look at it with skepticism. So when you're talking to your colleagues who meet the issue with skepticism or, in some cases, like abhorrence, how do you pitch them? How do you tell them, actually, I think this is an issue you should care about and you should reach across the aisle to your other colleagues and work on this?
Look, I feel like one of the clearest use cases for crypto is stablecoin. Like, I see the proliferation of dollar stablecoins throughout the world as a projection of American soft power. And the rapid growth of stablecoins is going to create rapidly growing demand for US Treasuries. Like, stablecoin issuers will eventually emerge as the largest owners of T-bills, surpassing even the Federal Reserve and Warren Buffett. And the greater the demand for US Treasuries, the lower the cost of US debt at a time when it's desperately needed because the interest on our debt is more than $1 trillion a year. So I think that's one powerful use case. And then look, if you're in the United States, we take a stable currency for granted, but in much of the world, a stable currency is hard to come by. And so as a result of stable coins, there are hundreds of millions of people in the global south who finally have access to a stable currency, who are finally protected from runaway inflation, who are finally protected from theft at the hands of their corrupt foreign governments. I've heard stories of people who have had their remittances stolen by their corrupt foreign government. And so for me, the beauty of the blockchain is that it protects the property rights of the least propertied. It's the great equalizer. Chris Dixon often draws a distinction between don't be evil and can't be evil. Instead of trusting corrupt foreign governments not to be evil, we should put our trust in the blockchain, which can't be evil.
I think that might be the first time that I've heard a Democratic congressman reference Chris Dixon in a public forum. It's pretty cool that you know who he is. Of course, there's a range. You recently,
Although I don't think Chris is a Republican. So, but
I've heard any congressman.
he's pretty
reference
apolitical.
Chris, yeah, it's apolitical. You recently introduced a bill related to banning federal officials from profiting off meme coins. Tell us a little bit about that bill. What inspired it? We might know, and sort of how it's going right now.
Look, I mean, it's inspired by the presidential profiteering from meme coins that we've seen from Donald Trump. I just have a basic belief that no elected official, not the president, not a member of Congress, should be promoting or issuing or selling a meme coin that bears their name or likeness. That to me is simply unethical. We should not be selling access to Congress or to the White House. And so that should be prohibited. I mean, that's, for me, it's straight. The president is not only promoting his meme coin, but selling it to the 220 highest bidders for his meme coin.
It's unclear to me whether or not that's a highest bidder or someone who's cheering you on.
Yeah, and in exchange for access to the White House. And I think that kind of monetization of the presidency is not only unethical, it should be prohibited by law.
I want to, great applause line there. I want to shift gears to talking about sort of your party and their sort of perception. I grew up in California. I'm a lifelong Democrat. You can look at my LinkedIn and sort of see evidence of that. So it's no secret. And Democrats, in my mind, had always been the party of pro-tech and pro-innovation. And I think that perception has rubbed off a bit recently. So I'm curious how you, as someone who is so out front in these issues, the advice that you have to your colleagues to reclaim the mantle of being the pro-tech and pro-innovations party. What can you do?
Look, I think any party or any country or any civilization that declares war on its own tech sector will ultimately rot from within. I mean, I see technology as the greatest strategic asset, not only for the United States, but for humanity. For most of human history, there was practically no economic growth. My understanding is from classical Greece to the Reformation, the economy grew by 2% a century. And then after the Reformation, after the advent of the printing press, it grew by 20% a century. And then after the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the 20th century, it grew by 2,000% a century. And so the clear lesson of history is that technology is the single greatest catalyst for human progress and prosperity. And every party in America should be pro-technology. Like emerging technologies like blockchain and biotech and AI and quantum computing should be neither Democratic nor Republican. It should be something that all of us embrace as a catalyst for human progress. So that's the mindset that we should internalize within the Democratic Party. But I feel like the central divide is not between Democrat and Republicans. It's not so much ideological as it is generational. I do feel like there's a new guard of Democrats who are much more open to embracing emerging technologies like blockchain. But as you know, Congress remains a gerontocracy. I jokingly tell people that I work for the most powerful senior center in the world. And I have colleagues who pronounce TikTok as tic-tac or meme coins as Memecoins. So I see it more as a generational challenge, and we have to overcome the outdated thinking of the gerontocracy in Congress.
Can you take us a little bit inside some of those conversations when you're educating some of your older colleagues about crypto or tic-tac, as it may were? What does that look like, and when are you most effective in engaging there?
Educating?
Educating your older colleagues. What does a most effective interaction look like there?
Look, I find that the colleagues who are the most hostile to crypto often know the least about it. There are just too many people in Congress who either do not know the subject or do not care to know. But if you actually take the time to study blockchain, it's just a revolutionary technology. I mean, it's, one of my favorite books is Sapiens, The History of Humankind by Yuval Harari. And he makes the observation that, we as humans are an exceptional species, And the basis for human exceptionalism is coordination and cooperation, right? We have the ability to cooperate and coordinate flexibly on a large scale. And I think of blockchain as like the greatest cooperative in the world. It's the greatest coordinator of human endeavor in the world. And there are going to be use cases associated with blockchain that we cannot foresee, but will change the world.
You probably have spoken more eloquently about blockchain than almost anyone else on the stage. Yeah, incredible way of being able to tie it together with Sapiens. I want to turn to the audience here and sort of double down on how we think about this generational or partisan divide and communicating it.
I'm not an ageist. I respect my elders, but yeah.
Well, of course, we all do. I just want to acknowledge the demographic trend of the last election, right? So historically, Democrats have been the party of younger people. And you have a lot of people in the audience here, overwhelmingly young, skews more male than female, interested in technology. These are the people that statistics show us that the Democrats are losing over time. So, you have a captive audience here who's excited about hearing from you. They're interested in this issue. They're also representative of, I think, a lot of the people that Democrats might have lost share among in the last election. So what's your message to them? How do you say, trust Democrats to be the party of innovation? How do you convince them?
I would look. I do not profess to speak for all Democrats, right? I think Will Rogers said, "I'm not a member of an organized political party. I'm a Democrat." And the Democratic Party is an ideologically varied coalition that ranges from the Squad to the Blue Dogs. So I would never presume to speak for the whole party, but I feel like the next generation of Americans feel the system is broken, and we as a party should think long and hard about how do we harness the power of technologies like blockchain to make the system work for a generation of Americans who feel left behind. Like I'll share an analogy with you. I represent a neighborhood in the Bronx that historically had been controlled by the mafia. And in order to run a business in the neighborhood, you would have to pay a toll or a tax to the mafia. And there's a sense in which like big tech is the mafia of the internet, of Web 2. And so I tell people, imagine a decentralized platform, a decentralized internet, where you can actually own the fruits of your labor. Imagine if Uber, the corporation, were replaced by Uber, the smart contract. It would mean drivers, creators can keep a greater share of their income. It would dramatically lower the take rates in our economy. And so if you build an economy around blockchain networks, it will lead to a much broader base of prosperity in our society. And I feel like that's a message of broad-based wealth creation that would resonate with the next generation of Americans.
I think it sounds like it does. It's a great message. I want to touch on a couple more points. One is to talk a little bit more about how we think about educating our colleagues on crypto and sort of striding the line between making sure that people in government are following clear ethical standards when it comes to making sure that they're not profiteering off their work, but also experimenting with the technology. So, when I used to work in government, there's a lot of issues around how people in government can interact with different tech. And I know from interacting with folks in government, over the past few years, you meet a lot of staffers who say, I want to learn more about crypto, but I can't download a wallet. Like, this is not a thing I can do from like an ethical perspective. How do you think about drawing that line? Obviously, you've cut sort of like a clear path when it comes to no presidential profiteering off of Memecoins. What does it look like on the other side? How do you open the door for interaction?
So I've actually never, it might come as a shock to people, I've actually never owned cryptocurrency. I've never used it. Just like I would not trade individual stocks, I feel like it's improper for me as a congressman to own or trade cryptocurrency because I'm actively regulating it. I have access to insider information, and I just feel it's improper for members of Congress to trade any financial instrument on the basis of insider information. But I also reject the notion that you have to have firsthand experience in order to legislate. I have no firsthand experience with flying an airplane, but I legislate on aviation safety. Like, as a member of Congress, I'm a generalist who's legislating over highly specialized areas of which I have no technical knowledge or with which I have no firsthand experience. But I feel like my job as a generalist is to process as much information as I can, listen to all sides of the argument, and figure out what's the best policy, figure out what's the best way forward. And that's what I feel I've done with respect to crypto and blockchain.
That's appreciated. I want to close out touching on some fun topics here. If anyone's tracked you on Twitter, or they've just been on Twitter after a hearing, they know you as the member of Congress who just like puts out the best Twitter bangers. Like you're really good at getting in front of the mic when former Chair Gary Gensler was up there, or during different hearings and talking about crypto.
I miss tormenting Gary Gensler. It was like I want him
back.
Last time. Actually,
it's the last time.
Yeah.
Well, tell us what it looks like to prepare for those hearings. What are the mechanics of putting together those Twitter bangers from an industry that really appreciates good social media?
So the social media virality is a byproduct rather than the purpose. When I'm crafting questions for a hearing, when I'm preparing to cross-examine someone like Gary Gensler, the goal is not to go viral. I actually feel like if you try to go viral, it will fail almost all the time. The goal is to take a complicated issue and distill it to its essence, to get to the core of an issue. And that's what I did not realize I would go viral, but, when I brought up the Pokemon hypothetical, it was not meant to be performative. It was actually meant to expose the flaws in Gary Gensler's theory of investment contracts. Because I said to Gary, look, if I were to sell you a Pokemon card, am I engaged in an unregistered securities offering? And he said no. And then I said, what if I were to engage in the same transaction through a blockchain? Is that a security offering? And then he said, it depends. And I said, why should it depend if you're technology neutral? Like, why should the nature of the technology you use magically transform a commodity into a security? And I did not realize that highly technical conversation about investment contracts would go viral. But my goal is not to be viral. My goal is to penetrate to the core of an issue. I did the same with the Yankee tickets. I said to Gensler, purchasing a Yankee ticket to access a Yankee game is no different from purchasing Stoner Cat's NFT to access an animated web series. And if you were to adopt the Gensler theory of investment contracts and say that anything that appreciates in value or anything that could be resold in a secondary market is a security, that would transform almost everything into a security. Collectibles would become a security. Artwork would become a security. And so I think my point was to show that his theory of investment contracts was so open-ended that it invites the weaponization of government against the crypto industry.
I think you did it very effectively. We just have a couple more minutes left. I want to take us into the future a little bit. There's a number of pieces of legislation that people are talking about over the course of the year related to crypto. What can we expect? What will happen over the course of the next month or two, and maybe for the rest of this congressional term in terms of legislation?
So both the House and the Senate, the House has passed legislation relating to stablecoin. We're actively working on market structure legislation because I think the lesson from the Gary Gensler era is that we desperately need regulatory clarity, right? Without regulatory clarity, what you have is regulation by enforcement. I often compared Gary Gensler's SEC to a traffic agent who would excessively ticket drivers without telling them the speeding limit. And my view is before the government tickets you, it has an obligation to tell you what the speeding limit is, what the law is.
It's not a controversial take.
No, it's not.
It shouldn't be.
Regulatory clarity is the cornerstone of compliance. And without regulatory clarity, there is no rule of law. There's only the rule of man. There's only the rule of Gary Gensler. And we saw the consequences of that approach. So I think the goal is to create a market structure bill that clearly defines here are the digital assets that qualify as securities, here are the assets that qualify as commodities, and here's the process by which a commodity can become, a security becomes so decentralized or so mature as to transform into a commodity. And I think if we provide regulatory clarity, we're removing the ceiling on the growth of the industry. Because I think once crypto has really the regulatory stamp of approval, the imprimatur of an act of Congress, the sky's the limit. I think the technology will go viral, even more so than it has now.
Time. Incredible.
So I think we're at a turning point.
I think that's true. If you walk around the halls.
The gerontocracy is losing and the future is winning.
The future is winning. You heard it right here. I love it. Thank you so much, Congressman Torres.
Of course.
We so appreciate your being here.
Absolutely.
Let's hear it for Congressman Torres.